Jesse, we're doing something special for next season. What is it?
The next season plan was questions from the community.
Yeah, we've got a lot of great questions from the community. Some of them have been brief, and we are going to incorporate them into season four. So while we're doing bonus episodes, dear listeners, send your questions for season four to jauntymantis at gmail.com and keep them brief.
Make him as long as you want. Ignore him. He doesn't even read the emails.
That's right. But he will awkwardly read them on the episode. So please keep it brief.
We could take the word picture interrogatives that you made with your fingers on a keyboard and transmit it through the medium of Spotify to an audience of tens.
And
So, yeah, write us with your questions.
hey, Jesse,
What's up, dude?
I have a question for you.
Yes.
D&D 5e 2024 is coming out, and you actually pre-ordered the book. So my question is, what are your first impressions of it, and what do you think?
Yeah, I think maybe I can.
Oh,
Because if I had to do an overview in one in one little pithy sentence, it's the Baldur's Gatification of Dungeons and Dragons.
well then I'm sold.
Yes.
Episode complete. Thank you.
So where do you want me to start?
Right at the beginning. What is okay, let's not do the beginning. Let's do this completely differently. What is the most notable positive change in 2024 that it clearly is doing head and shoulders better than 2014?
Oh, I'm torn because there's like two things that I think are just really brilliant.
All right,
So I'm
start.
gonna go with the thematic conceptual one. And
Okay.
I said this to you, but I'm gonna say it here. It does not have a dedicated combat chapter.
Wow. Okay.
Yes. So for reference, every edition of Dungeons and Dragons I have ever played has had a chapter, usually like chapter 6 maybe or chapter 8 sometimes, but a chapter called Combat. And this chapter just goes over combat. It gets its own section of the book. And the question I would then ask is, what do you think that tells players you do in the game?
What, when you have a huge important chapter dedicated to combat,
Yes.
it tells your players that combat is the most important thing. It's the chapter that's telling your players, hey, you have a hammer and everything in this game is now a nail.
Uh-huh. It's a nail with a number of hit points, and you're probably
Mm-hmm.
going to kill it. Yeah, it doesn't do that. It doesn't make combat its whole own subset of rules entirely outside the experience of the game.
But Jesse, how will I know how to hit things and for how much damage and positioning and grapple rules?
Well, you already do from playing 2014. It's like virtually the same, except inspiration's different.
Okay. How is inspiration different?
Heroic inspiration is what it's now called, as you may immediately re-roll a dice. That's one of the things that we talked about last
Any
night in
dice.
game.
Any
Yeah.
dice. Gotcha.
Rules as written in 2024 D&D, you can't get more than one, but if you gain inspiration when you already have one, you can pass it to someone, which I think is nice. Um, so yeah, the structure of that is like the first chapter is playing the game, and it starts with what an ability check is and how those works, and then uses that as the scaffold to build everything else on top of saving throws, skill checks, blah blah blah, all this stuff, attack rolls. Those are all just different versions of ability checks.
Mm-hmm.
It unifies it in a very straightforward and teachy game or teachy way. And when there's some weird one-off exception or something, it says this is in the glossary at the back of the book if you need to look this one up. And then there's a glossary for every major rule in the back of the book that you can just look up, which is what I did last night with the heroic inspiration thing. I was just
Mm-hmm.
curious because it was on the shelf. I flipped to the back of the book, used the words that were on the character sheet. There was a short, tight paragraph about what it was. I immediately knew what it was.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sort of thrilled about that. I think as a book for new players just coming into the hobby,
Mm-hmm.
like this is a fantastic, like this is probably the best starting point Dungeons and Dragons has ever had for someone who's a brand new player, or a brand new DM, to be honest, coming into the game.
Okay, why is that?
Well, so it does talk about the three tiers of play, a thing that we've kind of made fun of 2014 about.
Kind of made fun of.
Okay, we've
Yes.
totally made fun about it because, like, where's the dedicated exploration chapter? Where's the
Mm-hmm.
dedicated, like, social encounter chapter? There's subsections in the DMG. Uh, this has a subsection of the rules that again goes into the three tiers of play: exploration, social encounters, and combat. Except for each one, it talks about how the rules might be different in that tier of play, gives a full page example of play for that tier of play, and then has them, I think, in the order of exploration, social challenges, and then combat's last. But they're
Mm-hmm.
each just a little, like, three, I think, page spread in the playing the game section. So it's like if you don't have any preconceived notions about D&D and you read this book to learn how to play, you will not weight combat above exploration or
Hmm.
like social encounters. You'll think, "Oh, these are all things we do in the game."
Right. What is an example of how different social encounters are compared to combat encounters outside of the normal understanding that I have, which is in D&D 2014, there's some like the combat system is so much more robust than the skill system. Is there an equally robust component to using skills or even like dialing into a social encounter?
I don't think they I don't think they were looking to add robustness. I think they were looking to add a unified set of resolution mechanics and say this
Mm-hmm.
works for each one. So
Mm-hmm.
it highlights the skills that you might use in a social encounter and gives an example of like passive and active role playing. It explains what those are.
Okay, what
Like
are those?
like active is like I'm like when I'm doing my stupid accent for Shamish, which I
Mhm.
can't apparently stick, and whether he's Irish or from the North Country.
Mhm.
Like I keep doing Shire and I keep doing switch anyway. Like that's active, but when I narrate what my character's doing, that's passive.
All
Like it
right.
says both are acceptable. Like it's just got all these little touches. Like coming from our perspective, they don't add a whole new rule set to social encounters, but what they do is a much better job of laying out what they are, different ways you can engage with them, and then what they might look like. And
Mhm.
it's the same with exploration. They're
Okay.
really just giving more examples of ability checks. And the
Mhm.
combat section is the same thing. It doesn't get any more weight than anything else. And I admire them for that.
Mhm. But is that going to deliver the message to the already existent group of players and DMs? Like there is a point of view amongst like I don't pay a lot of attention to the gaming community like social media, Twitter, Reddit, all that. But sometimes when I do kind of poke my head out of the rock that I live underneath, sometimes I do see things online like D&D have we reached peak saturation, for instance, like 5e 2014. I will always tip my cap to it because it before apparently from what it sounds like this version is now the 2014 version made D&D the easiest and most accessible to pick up and start playing. So there's a running school of thought out there that because of that and Stranger Things and stuff like Critical Role and whatnot, we've reached peak saturation when it comes to the D&D gamer community. Like the speculation is that from this point moving forward, we'll probably have a significant amount of gradual drop off. And then like in 10 to 15, maybe even 20 years from now, it'll be a thing that people did back during this period of time, and they'll be like, "Oh yeah, I remember doing that." It's like it's not sustainable. Are you familiar with this argument, or did I just make this up out of whole cloth?
I haven't heard that argument before.
Okay, well, what do you think of that argument?
Um, I think that I don't think this hobby is going away anytime soon. I think
Hmm.
there may be a peak of like market value for selling of things like, but I don't think this is gonna fade in its broad scope of popularity like
Hmm.
anytime. I mean, like this is a thing you really invest in. Like, I mean, how long have I been playing since I was 9? And
Hmm.
next week I turn, or but no, this weekend I turned 45,
Hmm.
like
Oh, congratulations.
I've invested a considerable amount of time in this. Thank you. All I had to do was keep living. So there we go.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I don't know about peak saturation. I think this is the edition for the next version, for the next generation. Like
At least
this,
until they do a sixth edition.
yeah. But this one, they took everything that I think they did right or most everything they did right, and they pared it down and reorganized it to make it easier to get and easier to understand. And I don't think they really stripped away any complexity from the
Hmm.
game. They didn't like simplify it, they just drastically reordered it and trimmed the fat in areas where maybe they didn't need a system, or maybe they didn't need a mechanic, or maybe a spell wasn't that cool because you had to do like, you know, you had to use an action to cast Shillelagh. So
Hmm.
in order to get like one damage dice step up, I have to take a whole action and then I can hit someone with my quarterstaff on my next turn. That's not fun. Why would anyone take this spell?
Hmm. Hence the Baldur's Gate 3 change, which undoubtedly maybe wasn't the sole inspiration, but definitely put that change into like a a a mode that could be demonstrated, right? Like if you use Shillelagh in Baldur's Gate 3, you're like, oh, this is the better way for this to work. Like
Yeah, and
this is how it should have worked.
they were already there with spells like Green Flame Blade, like stuff that came out in Xanathar's and Tasha's, where they were like, "Oh, if this is a spell used by a paladin who's smiting, or a warlock who's like a hex blade, like yeah, the it's a you cast the spell as you're making the attack, and it's just part of the attack, like, or you do it as a bonus action and blah blah blah." Like
Right.
they were already there. They just this one brought up those spells in the 2014 Player's Handbook to that level.
Gotcha. So what's the second thing if that was the first huge change, first monumental change? What was the second one?
Um, I can't remember what I was going to say. I talked so much about the first
It
one.
was totally worth it.
It was oh god, what is it? Spells. Oh, the glossary. It was the glossary
Oh,
itself.
it was the glossary itself.
Yeah, the
Okay.
glossary itself just is like a resource. Like when I first saw this, of course, because they did a pre-release if you pre-ordered, like
Mm-hmm.
for the digital version. So I first saw this in the digital version where I was like, well, this is damn convenient. I can literally just click on the link like in the text and it takes me to the glossary entry. It's like
Mm-hmm.
designed to be searched on D&D Beyond. But once I got my hands on the physical book, like just as a reference point in the back, I'm like, oh, this still works. This is
Mm-hmm.
great. This is like
Mm-hmm.
the best index game since Rifts. So
Fantastic. All right. Okay, so okay, now that you've said those, is there anything that's disappointing about it? Something that they might have like changed for the worse? Maybe that's the cover of the YouTube video for this episode if that were to exist. Like they ruined it. Hasbro has destroyed everything. Oh, I can't believe it. You know. Yes, with all the appropriate pointing and obscene face gesturing.
red letter to something or a red arrow on something that has nothing to do with it.
Yep.
Yeah, I'll say the things that I think are not for me, and that's fine because I
Because
believe
you're
in
a
being
reasonable fucking
yeah, I'm
person.
a reasonable person and I regret the one episode we did where we kind of delved into hot takes for potential likes. So like, whatever.
Yep.
Um I don't really care for the aesthetic.
Oh, interesting. Just go into that more. What is the aesthetic and what don't you like about it?
There's a lot of influence from like in like the overall like character class art from like Korean RPG, like
Okay.
RPG video games.
Yeah,
You know the aesthetic I'm talking
I
about?
do. Yes.
Like layering like just bare torso parts on dudes for some reason. Like they all
Hmm.
look very handsome and charming, blah blah blah. But like none of the art for the subclasses makes me go, "Oh wow, cool, I want to play that."
Yeah.
And that's okay. It's not the inclusion issue. It's not because like I'm like when I see one that's like, "Oh, that's a grandma with some gray hair and she's going to kick some ass." I'm like, "Cool." But I think
Hmm.
she may be overdressed for her ass kicking.
Hmm. Hmm.
It is not the realistic like drawing of everybody with their backpack on all the time like we had in 3.5 for a while.
Right.
And that wasn't in 5e,
Yeah.
it's like I'm not saying, but like it's like the opposite end of that, which got me thinking about this because I was reading a review of the blue or watching a 60-second review on TikTok of the Blue Rose RPG.
Okay. What is the Blue Rose RPG?
So Blue Rose RPG is romantic fantasy,
Oh,
which is
okay.
described. This is a great description because I know we've talked about this before. It
Yeah.
was described as romantic fantasy is your characters are part of beneficent institutions who have a stake in like making things better for the people around them,
Hmm.
as opposed to like your characters are a disparate group of people who like maybe you rail against the darkness, but you're like off on the edges, outcasts, edge of society, or a strange group of companions like who have met because of this one quest.
Hmm.
Um, like you're all the Queen's Guard and you're going to go out there in the world and like stop this, blight from spreading. It has that vibe
Hmm.
to a lot
Okay.
of the art. Like that is just a feeling I get. And that's fine, but it's not what I'm used to. And so it's a little bit jarring. I don't
And
know.
would you say that that's more of a generational context? Like this is something that I think grognard gamers are gonna have to get used to at some point.
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah.
like D&D is this wonderfully evolving thing
Yeah.
in our world. Like
And the
that's what
aesthetic of the graphic artists who work on it has changed because they're, younger than me. They've come up with different ideas of what fantasy is, and it's
right.
totally fine. It's
Hmm.
just not gelling for me, and that's okay. Like that
Right.
doesn't make it wrong or bad in any way.
Right, right. Like the difference between people like you and me and I guess our equivalents is that you and I can look at something that we don't like and we can say I don't like this or I think this is bad or whatever, but it doesn't matter. I'll move on. It's fine. I'll either lose interest in the thing and stop being a consumer of it, or I can just roll with it and be like, well, I personally like you brought up third edition D&D's art aesthetic. Big surprise. That was my favorite art moment of
What?
D&D.
No.
I liked the very textured, very like detailed in their gear and what they
if it's not
had.
if it's not color, it looks like it's a pencil drawing on parchment paper.
Yeah. And like even the covers of the original 3.0 and 3.x player's handbook, DM's guide, even all the monster manuals, even going up to I think 5.
The
They
ones
all
that were
had
textured to look like
Mhm.
hide with an eye on them.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It kind of gave you this feeling that like this could be a book one of your characters could find. It might look like this, and if not, like it just kind of puts you in that mode. And I really appreciated that. But I'm perfectly okay with that being that time and place. And I may not like the art that you're describing, or I may open it up and absolutely love it. Um, but the I guess the difference is that like I don't care. It doesn't matter. Like I might get on our podcast and say I don't like the art of something, but then it ends there. I'm not trying to like complain about the game forever being ruined because I
Yeah.
didn't like the fact that such and such or that they changed races to species or that like orcs are now like creatures with souls and families and nuance even though they kind of always were going back to Tolkien, if you really look into it.
Don't bring up rings of power, dear God.
So like I guess that's the big difference, right? And the gist of what you're saying. And my long-winded rant here is that like what I love about D&D is that at one point in time, 3.x mainly, that was my sweet spot. And I am 45 years old, and I've had my time with this hobby, and there's been all the editions leading up to the first edition, second edition, advanced, leading up to third edition when it really hit that sweet spot for me, and then it kind of just moved past me into a new generation, and I'm totally okay with it. I'm
Yeah, I
totally
think
okay with it.
one of the things that I kind of did in my reflection during the pandemies, as you know, was to work on saying I didn't like it instead of it's bad.
Right. That is,
Um,
I agree. Yeah.
because like my taste does not make something subjectively bad. And if I could describe one thing that is absolute poison in our culture, it's that saying that something you don't like is bad or it sucks or it's terrible or it ruined your childhood.
Right.
Like when describing media properties, in politics, I still think that's totally okay, but that's me.
You and everybody else in America, buddy.
Yep. So yeah, I think like I don't care for the overall aesthetic. There are some cool, it's not bad art in any way. It's just the overall aesthetic like is not clicking for me. It's not my D&D, and that's totally fine. Like here's just the litmus test, right? So I'm looking through the subclasses, right? And each
Mm-hmm.
subclass gets a full bar art on the side of the page. There's like none of them that are exciting to me. There's
Mm-hmm.
like not a single one where I'm like, oh, that looks cool. I want to do that. So that's been my go-to in previous D&D books is to look at the character class and be like, which picture looks cool? So this
Yes.
one you actually have to read it. And when you read it, there's cool stuff. Like
Yes.
there's definitely cool stuff. I am spoiled for choice with the 4 monk subclasses in there. I don't know which one I'm going to do.
Yeah. You're describing to me what I would call the Sigmar effect. Like when we were playing the Age of Sigmar role playing game, when I first opened the PDF on that book after buying it from Drive Through RPG, I was like, oh my God, I want to play this. And then you go to the next page, oh my God, I want to play this.
And then you
Like,
get to the naked dwarf with the mohawk helmet and the axe full of lava and you're like,
yeah.
"Oh, well, you know."
Yeah. And they have so many really cool art pieces in that really sell the concept of the character that you want to play, and then the decision becomes shit, what am I going to play? Like what you know, like which one of these awesome things am I going to play? So I get it, I get it there. You brought up classes and subclasses, but let's start with I guess the book would start with ability scores. Are ability scores any different than they were in 2014? Have there been any changes there?
Nope, they're same.
Okay.
Same scale. They
And
still kept generating the number.
besides races now have been changed to species officially.
Yes. Yes, here's the other thing. You don't get like attribute bonuses from your species.
Okay, so that's changed about attributes,
Yes, you get it from your background.
which is how it probably should have been from the start if
Yes.
you really think about it.
Yeah. The one thing, this is weird. I never thought I'd be here, but I agree with Jenny D.
I don't know who
Like,
that is,
oh,
so
she
awesome.
is a D&D YouTube personality.
Oh, fantastic.
Who also does cosplay and sings. Um, she gives advice for new DMs. That's actually pretty helpful.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, I don't know. But like they took out the ideals, bonds, and flaws tables
Mm-hmm.
for the backgrounds. I miss that. I know a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people didn't really use it because rules is written in 2014. It's like whenever you act according to one of these, you should gain inspiration. Like that's what they were for. But from the very moment that launched, nobody ever really did anything from it other than get a tool proficiency or like
Right.
proficiency with dragon dice.
Yeah. Or three dragon ante. I've
Oh
got a
yeah,
deck of cards. I know
can't
how to
forget
play
that.
it.
Yes.
Yeah. I was a stalwart for the ability score benefits and penalties for the races, now species. I held on out on that for so long because I was one of those uh fantasy fans that was like, no, elves are more graceful and agile than everybody else. And that should be reflected in their base, I guess, their kit for who they're species is at this point. Like that should always be reflected. So if you're an elven wizard or an elven fighter, like that grace should always be there no matter what. But it wasn't until that Keith Baker's podcast about Eberron where he talks about how you can thematically change magic so that the mechanics aren't different, but the aesthetic or the themes of it in your game is different. Like elves might have produced better magic. They understand magic at a depth and level and complexity that humans may never understand. But because of human ingenuity and versatility, humans have been able to come up with magic that works faster and is more potent, or any other kind of descriptive thematic element you want to make. And mechanically, it all kind of just works out the same. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? And this is also characterized in the cipher system game, where the cipher system uses these descriptors to make your character class. And they say things like, we know you're going to want for a cipher system fantasy game to make a descriptor that's like elf. But what we want to implore upon you is maybe don't do that. Maybe just think elves can be many things. And if your elves are graceful, you can say, well, elves typically have the following descriptors, and maybe graceful is one of those descriptors, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I crossed over on that officially. And I think background makes way more sense for having an ability adjustment.
Yeah, I'm way more mercenary about it. I just want to get to add something to an attribute. I don't care where it comes from. Like,
Yeah. Well, that's the other side of it, right? Because going back far enough, it's like you see this in video games, you see this in role playing games where it's like, I want to min max and make the best possible two-handed dagger wielding shadow knife or whatever. Well, you got to take half elf and get this, and then use this weapon, pick these feats, and that starts to get boring for someone like me, you
yeah.
know.
The
Uh,
like I love too that like they have these backgrounds. The backgrounds don't really have like one of the no one really ever used them, but like the old backgrounds kind of had a cool distinctive place in the world feature. Like the folk
mhm,
hero had the peasant hospitality one, and the
mhm,
soldier had like I recognize someone from my old unit here. Like
right.
nobody really ever used those, but I thought they were thematically cool.
They should
But
have
get
though.
but removing them like doesn't really, since we never used them in the first place, doesn't really feel like a loss other than oh. Um so
Mhm,
yeah, I don't know. Like, and they have a very it's very easy. They follow a very systematic approach. So there's a little thing, how to make your own background. Decide whether you get like a feat or whether you get more tool proficiencies. Pick the attribute bonuses, go. And I
mhm,
spent a while because I I had this moment where I was like super in. I had listened to Fall of Civilizations, and I remembered that there was an old 3.5 Green Ronin Press expanded book that was like Testament role playing in the biblical age. And I was like, yeah, cool. I want to be a Syrian. So it's like to wrap my head around it, I tried to make backgrounds like chariot driver, like
mhm,
you are a chariot driver. And so like, what would that be? And I couldn't do it. I just
mhm,
couldn't, like, I couldn't do it. Now with this system, I could. You would get a bonus to Constitution because you have to breathe in the dust all the time. And you would get a bonus to Wisdom. Um, or maybe charisma for animal handling, and then you would be proficient in chariots,
mhm,
and you would get some like mounted combat feat. There you go. You're a
mhm,
chariot driver. I don't have to think about what's the crazy cultural ramification feature that's not a feat or anything, but just a thing you can do, because that's where I
right,
always got stuck.
right. Yeah, what kind of mechanical changes can I make for a background that isn't so much that it should be a feat, but isn't so little that it's not worth doing? Like nobody would ever do it.
Yeah.
It was like when you made that example of like testing out a role playing game on your kids, and your daughter was like, can I have a mechanical element that never comes up and I don't ever have to deal with it? Like so I think that's an important distinction to make. Um, Tell me about the species then. Like, do we have new ones? Are we hitting all the core benchmark? Like elf, dwarf, human, dragonborn, tiefling.
Asmir is in now,
That makes sense.
or
Yes.
Azamar, however
What
you
about
pronounce that.
Genasi? It seems
Ooh,
like all of those should just all go under one like heading, like plain touched or something like that.
yeah. Well, the Genasi, they're Genasti.
Yeah. Hmm.
Sorry, I'm checking. Let's
You got
see. Chapter. Oh, yeah. Species. There's a chapter 4 character origins that starts with backgrounds, and
mhm.
then the back section of that is species descriptions. And there's Azamar, Dragonborn, Dwarf, Elf, Gnome, Goliath, Halfling, Human, Orc, and Tiefling.
Mhm. That's to be expected.
So
Surprised. The only one I'm surprised to see in the list is Goliath as part of the base set.
they needed a default big dude.
That's true. D&D has always kind of suffered from the big dude, to be perfectly honest. And it is kind of a staple of like definitely of anime, for sure. To have that like really, really big guy. And I think with the advent of Critical Role, I don't watch the Critical Role actual plays only because actual plays bore me to death. But I love that Critical Role exists. I'm a fan of what those nerds are doing. But I have watched Vox Machina, and they do have like a big guy character
Well, he's
who
a
it's like
Goliath.
that's a Goliath. Yes, exactly. So that makes sense to add that. Like the popularity of Critical Role ensures that that's going to be in there, right?
Yep.
Okay, classes. What's changed about classes and I guess subclasses other than what you just
Everybody
said?
gets their subclass at level 3.
Mm-hmm.
That's the main thing. Other than that, there's just some new features. Rangers kind of don't suck. um,
When have Rangers not sucked?
Rangers have kind of sucked for a while in 2014.
They've kind of always sucked. The only time I think Rangers haven't sucked maybe have been when they were first introduced or in fourth edition. Maybe Rangers were terrible in third edition, even when they got updated in 3.5.
Yeah,
They
they were
still weren't that
terrible, and
great.
they were terrible. Well, until they got like the Gloomstalker or some of the other like subclasses, they were kind of terrible because if you pick like the Hunter one or whatever, like the favored terrain, well, the moment you leave your favored terrain, the coolest thing on your character sheet doesn't work anymore. And since
Mm-hmm.
there were no real like teeth to the exploration mechanic, all your advantages in the exploration phase of the game, they didn't really tell you how to do, didn't matter. And your
Mm-hmm.
animal companions tend to suck and get killed. Like, so
Yeah, I always wondered like why didn't they make favored terrain like something that your character can do when it gets into a terrain? Like your ranger, you're coming out of the forest, you're getting into the mountains, and then your ranger can do a ritual and make mountains now their current favored terrain. Like they're adapting to their environment. If you want to go a magical route, like they're connecting with the spirits of nature or whatever the case may be, or maybe they're just like getting used to being in a different terrain, and you could say like that change can only take place a certain number of times, and then as you go up in level you can change it or have multiple or whatever the case may be. I never understood why it was like your favorite terrain is forest, and it's like, well, fuck, I'm done as soon as we're in the mountains. My
yep.
character
Or
is
the desert.
terrible.
God help
Yeah.
us if we go underwater.
Yeah, and in 3.x D&D, the fighter could do most of the cool things the ranger could do, but just way better because of the feat system, like dual wielding or like archery shit, was done better by the fighter because you just take those appropriate bonus feats. So the hallmarks of the ranger really did kind of get lost because they were amalgam of other classes. Like the druid always had the better animal companion in 3.5, and so on and so forth.
Well, the
So,
druid is his own animal companion. So.
yes.
Um, I will say one of the things I haven't read much into it, but one of the things that kind of excites me is that I think fighters and martial characters, like there is a mastery tag on every weapon that they can interact with at a certain level that lets them do crazy shit with the weapon that they have mastery in.
Okay.
I haven't read much about that yet. I just know it's in there and it's a bookmark to read. And then so that's a cool new addition to your martial archetype characters. Yeah, and then it's the classes that we know, and they up their power level a little bit, so there's not a lot of dead levels for most of them.
Hmm.
Um, Monk got a glow up in both mobility and how often you can do stuff, and that's kind of cool. And then the back part of the book until the appendix is almost all the spells
Hmm.
because it's a huge part of the book. I'm excited for the DMG to come out.
Why is that?
Jeremy Crawford on a stream with some D&D influencers. It still feels weird to me that exists. Uh, on a stream with some D&D influencers, like revealed that there is a full-on magical item crafting rules in the GMG and like an
Okay.
economy thing for like buying and selling magical items and crafting them.
Hmm.
So you don't have to get some third-party thing to like figure out how people buy and sell. Like they're at, I mean, I guess that too goes with the vibe that I'm talking about in the art. They're upping the fantasy.
Hmm. Yeah, I would say that's another like Critical Role era artifact, or not artifact, but feature of like you can go to the magic item shop and buy any magic item or whatever they have. The video gamification that has come back to role playing games, considering that video games have been, inspired or taken so many elements from role playing game, uh, from a role playing game structure, right? So there's been so many instances where I have openly resisted the idea of a magic item shop because I always felt like it kind of cheapened the overall experience. It made magic items less special, in my
Mm-hmm.
opinion. Like I want that sword that the character finds to be like really cool, really special, and rare enough that like you're gonna want to hold on to it for as long as possible. But that's just not a baked in system. A baked in system is you replace a +1 with a +2, you replace a +2 with a +3, and so on and so forth. Like that's just
There's
how it goes.
this is a tangent, but I was literally just last night I was reading the One Ring RPG,
Mm-hmm.
the section about running the game and like treasure. Because I
Mm-hmm.
was like, I've got this treasure rating on my character sheet, but I don't really know what it means. And one of the things that they point out to do is like when you find a hoard, and it says how often you should find a hoard of art, they're like many ages of the world have passed. There's, things out there. When you find a hoard, you need to make a magic item list. Like you need to make a treasure index for your party. Like, don't ask them what they want, but you should put a number of things in each category, like wondrous items, artifacts, and like famous weapons and armor. You should put each about this many for each, and then just have that on your table. So when they find a hoard, you could do that. And the idea is much like Orchist and Glamdring found in the Troll Horde and Sting, or the halfling swords they found in the Barrow White. Like those are placed there by fortune. Like those are
Mm-hmm.
like because there is a purpose for you finding them.
Right.
And like it's the subtle magic of Middle Earth, the subtle magic of the Valar. And I'm like, oh, that's super cool.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the exact opposite of like a
Yes.
magic item shop.
Yeah.
But it's also sort of the opposite of like D&D's approach where there's just scattershot roll on this giant table. There's magic items like everywhere. There's a finite number of things that are particularly of use to you that the fates have placed before you because they will become part of your legend if you can, stay alive and stay resist the temptation and taint of shadow, which is a very Lord of the Rings thing. And I think to bring that back to our conversation on that slider,
Mm-hmm.
like when you talk about like high fantasy, low fantasy, versus like I don't know, like grim dark or sword and sorcery, like there's sort of this continuum of how big of a role magic plays in it. And I think if you start back in the very first edition, it was very much, if you read appendix in, very much sword and sorcery,
Mm-hmm.
like grim, low magic. There are spellcasters, but there's like one, who's powerful. And then as you go on, that slider starts kind of ticking up. Second edition was still kind of grim. Third edition, slider maybe went up a little. They did have magic item creation rules, but the overall aesthetic was still kind of in that sword and sorcery. 4E with the Points of Light campaign starts to move that fantasy level a little higher. 5E moves it a little higher still, and then 5E 2024 is just like full on Final Fantasy 11. Like,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this, like I was mentioning earlier, I think this is a perfect example of a thing I don't like, but I can be okay with the fact that it exists.
yeah, I
Right.
don't have to use those rules in my game.
Right.
Like, but just like also too, to go back to that DMG point, the way this is organized and laid out as an actual toolkit to teach someone how to do the thing, I'm really excited to see what's in the DMG.
Yeah. And in Baldur's Gate 3, like in a video game, I love saving every magic item I find. That's what I do. If it's a special magic item, meaning that it has a specific thing it does, it's not just a +1 sword or a +2 armor piece or whatever. Like I will save all of these items because I want to combine them in different ways with other items I find and other characters' abilities,
But
and
what's
that's
Gale gonna
fun.
eat?
Well, I love Gale. I'll keep him alive. Um, but yeah, but like that's that in a video game, I absolutely love that. I love buying magic items in stores. In my role-playing game, one of my all-time favorite fantasy settings is Star Wars. And Star Wars has, as a part of space fantasy, this element that the force is moving things along with a subtle and sometimes even overt push that the whatever that fabric of the universe is pushing things in a certain direction. And like I liked that concept, and I like that concept in my traditional fantasy games as well,
Yeah, I
as you
get the
described.
impression that is not the default state. And again, this is
Yeah.
just an impression, too early to tell, but that I not the default state in DMG 2024. I'm gonna make
Mhm.
that call now. I could be wrong. It doesn't matter. There's like zero stakes to me being wrong on that call. So
Yeah. What about feats in the new player's handbook? Because feats was that was supposed to be something back when it was D&D Next, if I remember correctly, where they were like, feats are going to be take them or leave them, and they clearly weren't leave them. They were clearly became take them. Like I can't imagine any 5e game that wasn't using feats.
oh really? I played lots of them through the early arc. Like I didn't use feats in my game. It was just the ability score improvement.
Yeah,
Because the
but that
feats
makes
weren't
sense.
impressive.
Yeah, but that changed, don't you think? Like I would agree with you in the early days of 5e when I first like tried out playing it. Like I totally agree with you. I was happy to be like, "Hey, feats are gone. Like let's just play this as is." But that doesn't seem like that's the case anymore. It seems like feats are the mechanism that enable a lot of 2014 5e's gameplay or character creation.
Oh, I disagree.
Oh, well, how so?
I just don't think that in the feats are they're like there aren't deep trees.
Mm-hmm.
None of them are really that unique. They're all sort of kind of like the chromatic dragon ones from the dragon guy that make you slightly resistant to an energy type, or like I mean, I just none of them. The later books started giving you feats that let you get an attribute bonus two and then some minor effect, and like I'd take one of those, but I never built a character around a feat.
Mm. Well, that is where you and I part ways on this because one of the things that I used to get okay with 5e was that I liked the idea that you could look up online and see builds that other people had made for, multi-class, subclass combinations. And 9 out of 10 times they included very specific feat choices. So, yes, it's not as in depth as from what we remember as third edition feats, but it seemed like to me looking up a build online, it always included like an absolute cornerstone feat in order to complete that build structure for that character.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to clarify, like I would totally do that, but the players in my games didn't.
Hmm.
And it didn't really seem to negatively impact the play experience at all that they weren't like having this optimal feat. So the feats section, it's its own chapter. It's 12 pages. And they divide them. This is really pretty interesting. They divide them into a couple different types. Like there's categories, like there's origin feats that you get from your origin. There's general feats that like can be picked just sort of at will, I think, with level up and feats. And then I think there's combat, fighting style feats. Like
Mhm.
there's like different categories and there's different ways you pick them up. So the origin feats lets you customize where you came from. The general feats are just little weird off skills or something, and then the fighting style feats are, well, fighting styles. Um, so yeah, it's only 12 pages, but it just feels immediately more in depth. And also everybody gets one at first level. So,
Mhm. Mhm. Do
and they're
you
not listed
gain
as an optional rule like they were in the 2014 Player's Handbook.
right? I think that kind of settles it from my perspective about that topic. But like, do you gain feats at all as you progress in the character classes, or is it only really in the beginning?
No, yeah, you gain feats.
Okay. Is it like at a rate that you did like in third edition, where I think it was like every third level you got a feat, and then certain classes like fighter would get like a bonus feat every other level or something like that?
Let me check. I'm not actually quite sure.
Because oftentimes that's what worked against like a character like the fighter who used fighter bonus feats, is like the modular customizable aspect of the fighter was really cool, but what it really came down to is there weren't in class milestones of power increases to ensure that you were as comparable as the other classes, like a druid or a cleric or a wizard, a specialist wizard. And that was one of the drawbacks to third edition, is the fighter very quickly got left behind when it came to the other classes, and it was because of the feat based system. And they tried to fix that with like Tome of Battle, which was basically making like combat maneuvers that were spell like, and there were some other things that I think that they tried to do along the way as well to try to make up for it, but I don't think it ever really truly landed per se. I'm
Yeah,
interested to
it's
see how this has changed.
they made ability score improvement a feat.
Okay.
And it every 4 levels thereabouts, at least looking at the barbarian, every 4 levels they get a new feat, ability score improvement. It says level 4, you gain the ability score improvement feat, see chapter 5, or another feat of your choice for which you qualify. Gain this again at levels 8, 12, and 16.
Mm-hmm.
So it's
Gotcha.
not like the every 2 levels, I think, was 3.5. Like,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah.
Every three, 1, 3, 6, 9, 12, that and so on and so forth. I think it was every third level. The
Oh,
ability
look at you,
increases were
fancy counting man. That's
every
number
fourth
wang.
level. That is number one. Are there any cool like new subclasses? Or are there any
They
new classes?
there's no new classes. And the classes are the classes you know from 5e. They have psionic ones built in.
Interesting.
The soul knife is a default subclass of the rogue. The psionic warrior is a default subclass of the fighter. And then the like aberrant weird sorcerer is a default subclass of the sorcerer. So psionics is sort of baked in.
How do you feel about that? Because I think on a previous episode you were like, I don't want to learn a new system.
Well, it's not a new system. Like
Well,
it's
that's what
just
I'm saying. Does that meet with your approval? Does that make you happy to see psionics baked in instead of having to be a separate system?
yeah, no, I'm happy with that. I mean, I played a soul knife when that came out, and I think in Tasha's or Xanathar's or whatever it was.
Hmm.
So I got to say Mind Blade like 10,000 times.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, it's just cool that that's that different source of power that's flavored out there because I think with that fantasy sort of style, your character should be fairly unique. You don't need a grand unified theory for like why everything's out there. And if you do discover an order of like, psychic warriors that are out there, like, oh, that's neat. I didn't know they existed. So
Right.
yeah, it's cool.
So, all right. Well, that makes sense. Are there any other things that have changed from editions that would fall into a first impressions category?
Nothing that's jumping out at me like now that's like in the forefront of my mind. I think overall, the aesthetic is very like it's a modern aesthetic. It's not for my generation, and that's fine. It doesn't really take me out of the book. It just makes me read more to find out what is actually on the page rather than making assumptions based on the art. I think it's the best organized copy of the player's handbook I've ever seen. I think what they made the subclasses do for each character is pretty interesting and unique of the ones I've had time to read through. I really like that they sort of like give teeth to the other like tiers of play, exploration and social, like right from the get-go.
Mhm.
And overall, I'm pretty darn happy with it.
That's good. Yeah. With all the changes, because I don't want to go into like the orcs are people now debate and all the other things that people have had problems with over the years, and specifically around some of the hot takes around those particular aspects of the new edition. But it does also make me wonder why Wizards of the Coast doesn't release specific campaign settings that are more geared towards us. In addition, like if they're like, this is the new player's handbook, this is how everything looks, this is how everything works now. And then they're like, oh, hey, by the way, Grognards, here's this other new campaign setting that we've started. And it's got all of these rule changes in it. Now it's grimdark and orcs are bad, nameless bad guys again, and these different things. And if you don't collect your food and eat it, you die and you could get a disease and like all these other things. Like, why doesn't Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast just do that? Like, why don't they just be like, hey, Grognards, we didn't forget about you. Here's the additional setting book that has all these necessary changes to play the game closer to the way that you remember it thematically.
Because most grognards are Gen X and we're the smallest demographic.
But you understand what I'm saying, though,
Yeah,
right?
well,
Like,
I mean, like, there's two or three, I think, up on Beyond that's now compatible with D&D Beyond, like
mm-hmm,
Grim Hollow or whatever.
mm-hmm.
That is it's that more grim and dark, like 5e book that you can totally use with their stuff, and now on D&D Beyond. I think
So there it is.
I would say this. I heard this is apocryphal. A guy I work with, a really cool guy, like older guy, drove tanks in the army, I think in the first Desert Storm. Like he's an older guy. But like he loves BattleTech. And
Mm-hmm.
he was telling me today he caught me and a friend of mine playing Magic the Gathering at lunch, a thing I now do because I'm, just I wasn't cool enough and now I'm super cool. Uh, so he was like, "Oh yeah, no, I'm never going back to that. I'll never forgive Wizards of the Coast for buying the BattleTech CCG and then killing it and letting it die." And I'm just like, "Oh, well, I mean, it makes sense to me because Wizards had just bought TSR and their internal research had determined that TSR killed itself by making too many product lines that were too different from other people, whereas
Mm-hmm.
people would buy who bought this would not buy this." Dark Sun people would not buy Forgotten Realms, etc. And so they just wanted to centralize the share, you
Yeah,
know. And I think that's the answer. That's historical company culture.
right.
Even if Hasbro wants them to at Wizards, I think they don't think there's money in it, basically. I think it
Yeah.
fracture the community and then get them a PR stunt from the younger, more socially minded on very online people. That
Mm-hmm.
is another storm they just don't want. And I don't blame them at all.
Yeah, I mean, this person's because I've heard statements like this before, and I'm not meaning to pick on your friend, your work friend or anything, but like I've heard these kind of statements before. And that makes a lot of assumptions. That makes the assumption that they did this maliciously, that they ended that line or any other line or discontinued a product or changed things out of nefarious intent, which is simply not true. Like, no company out there that wants to make money is like, hey, let's purposely piss everybody off. Like, that does happen. Don't get me wrong. We've seen a lot of that come out of Wizards of the Coast over the last couple of years. It happens. But it's really weird how people like create these convoluted theories in their head about how these companies are purposely doing these bad things, and they'll never forgive them for ending this line. And it's like, well, how do you know they don't like uh didn't lay awake at night being like, shit, I really love BattleTech, but I don't want to end this line, or this product we really wanted to keep it, but we just couldn't because we're also reporting to people who require us to make money, like as a company, Corpo Matty here, I guess. But like, I know that corporations can be soulless and have evil practices, and I know that people in the search for money and wealth can put people into a state of like hellish capitalism that ruins other people's lives. Don't get me wrong, but like I just don't see it the way that your work friend is putting it. Like, yeah, it sucks to lose things, but I don't feel like they would do something like that maliciously. So what else would they have to choose from? Like should they keep a line floating and lose money on it when their data probably shows them it's not profitable?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, like he was like tournament ranked. Like
Mm-hmm.
so like obviously he has like a different stake in it. And I
Yeah,
just
for
looked it
sure.
up on Wikipedia. Apparently Wizards of the Coast developed it for
Gotcha.
FASA. Like Richard Garfield, the guy who designed Magic the Gathering, designed the BattleTech game.
Yeah.
It actually uses untap in its language. Like so
Mm-hmm.
like this was Wizards didn't buy it and then let it wither. Wizards made it and then ran it for I guess like 5 years and then probably saw flagging sales and was like, okay, we're done with this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anybody who's worked in a corporate environment knows that like there's people higher up and higher up and higher up that are get further and further detached from the people that have to make the decisions to cut things. Everybody gets put under that same kind of pressure. And I
Yeah.
just don't see a lot of maliciousness happening in that regard. I see unfortunate, horrible things happening. Um, you know, but it
Sometimes
doesn't,
those things are people. Like,
yeah, yeah, for sure.
but it's like yeah, and you can usually see the writing on the wall when stuff like that's coming, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like and it's just someone up top's going to make a decision based on data that your picture that you're not seeing, and maybe it's the wrong decision. Maybe if they'd listened to the people down below, it could have been avoided, but they didn't. That's where they are, and that's what they're going to do. And game products do that as well. Like we were actually going through this list, like that's like a member berries of like all of the once mighty empire
Mm-hmm.
of CCG games that existed from like 1995 until like the early 2000s. Like
Right.
when everybody was like, oh, well, this Magic the Gathering people and these Pokemon people, same people, have got this lightning in a bottle. Let's chase the competition and make our own game to try and take their market share that
Mm-hmm.
they've already had a fully developed game like to market 2 years before us with like a built-in community of people that playing. Sorry, Star Trek The Next Generation, the collectible card game. Sorry, the first Star Wars collectible card game. Sorry, Jihad. I'm sorry, Vampire the Eternal Struggle. Sorry,
Yeah.
Werewolf Rage. Sorry, Illuminati New World Order. Sorry, Over the Edge. I may have bought a lot of CCGs back in the
Mm-hmm.
90s.
Mm-hmm. As a lot of those things go, like World of Warcraft is a perfect example of this. Like
That was a good game.
the MMO genre was one that didn't even know there was a potential that World of Warcraft could get like I think at one point in time they had like 12 or 13 million.
I think 16 was the cap. And I also thought you were talking about the World of Warcraft collectible card game.
They also had that one as well. But like other companies tried to make MMOs and people are like, why are they even trying? Like they're not going to dethrone World of Warcraft. And it's like most of them weren't trying to. They were just trying to get a small sliver of that because if World of Warcraft had like 13 million worldwide subscribers, if one of these other companies could get a million annual worldwide subscribers, like they could be profitable. They would have something. They could run on that. It just didn't turn out to be that way. Overall, the genre couldn't support it. And I think in the case of CCGs, it's just like there isn't enough out there at that point in time to support it. And but then again, once the digital aspect comes along, once iPads become a thing, once you can put games on your phone and Hearthstone starts giving Magic the Gathering a run for its money and forces change, So it's like you can have different eras of games and products in that regard.
Yep.
All
New
right.
player's handbook.
This has been two D&D shills talking about their first impressions of D&D 5e 2024. Jesse, do you have any closing statements or interesting points about the new system? Are you excited about the players or the DM's guide and the monster manual for 2024 5e?
Yeah, I'm really excited about the DMG. I don't know if I'd say I'm excited about a monster manual. It's going to be a monster book.
Mhm.
They have some monsters for like animal companions and wild shape forms in the book.
Okay.
So the new stat block is really streamlined and simplified, easier to read.
Mhm.
Um, so I don't, is it possible to be excited about a monster manual these days?
That's a great question. I would have said Flea Mortals was a monster book you could get excited about, where the whole point of MCDM's book was to take more of a 4E approach to the nuance and minutia of like in-depth like grid style combat play for monsters, to give like to redo your traditional thoughts on monsters by giving them like new features and new quirks and new aspects to like give your players a run for their money. So I think in that regard you can. But
Okay,
as
yeah,
far
I
as like, this basic set 5e monsters, it's like, all right, bus monster again, Aarakocra, Minotaur, all the
and keg.
dragons. Yeah. Like,
Um, okay. Yeah, I think like monsters know what they're doing. That's a monster book I'm excited about.
yeah.
Um, and then Bestiary rework by Skirples, that is an OSR game that like just gives you color for different monsters. So like a rollable table for how's this one different from the normal ones. That's what I'm excited. But yeah, I'm not bummed, but I'm not excited because it's just the monster book for D&D. I will need
Mhm.
it if I'm running a 2024, or that'll actually be out in 2025. So I'll need it if I'm running a full-on D&D campaign next year.
Mhm. Mhm.
But right now, I'm obsessed with getting everything I can for Savage Rifts, the Savage Worlds version of Rifts, to continue the Rifts adventures, but in a system that has like understandable mechanics.
Oh, I think Rifts has understandable mechanics.
Okay.
You just have to do a little bit of work to seek them out.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, that's my last thoughts on the Player's Handbook 2025 Savage World Rifts.
All right. All right. Well, listeners, boy, we've all had a little bit of fun tonight, haven't we? Talking about the 2024 5e Player's Handbook. If you have any questions or comments about the new edition or about anything else we've talked about on this episode or any episode of the Jaunty Mantis, you can reach us at jauntymantis@gmail.com, or you can talk to Jesse on social media at Jawanty Mantis on Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
Jesse, am I forgetting anything?
We are now Jaunty Mantis TTRPG podcast on TikTok. I do actually make stuff
Oh,
on there,
yeah.
not necessarily RPG related all the time, but sometimes it's Warhammer. I don't know.
Yeah. And this will probably be one of, few last episodes before we go into season 4. Season 4 will be featuring listener questions, and that is still an open invitation. So if you have a question for these two curious nerds, if you've got a creative question for us, that's what the Jaunty Mantis is. It's a tabletop role-playing game podcast where we have curious gamers who ask creative questions.
Did we not introduce the format today? We didn't introduce the format.
No, we did. It's a bonus episode.
Okay.
All right. Well, Jesse, I love you, and I'll
Love
see
you
you next
too.
time. And until next time, get out there and play some fucking role-playing games.
Play some games or some shit. I don't know.
Yeah.